Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Elias Aboujaoude. So Dr. Aboujaoude is a Stanford University psychiatrist and the author of Virtually You, The Dangerous Powers of the E-Personality. His work explored OCD, impulse control disorders, and the intersection of psychology and technology, focusing both on the negative aspects and the potential benefits, hence why we have him here today. His research and writings have been widely covered, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. Please help me welcome Dr. Elias Aboujaoude. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for the question. Thank you, Jeff, for the invitation, and thank you, Erica Plavin, for introducing me to after school. So I titled my talk. Where's the introductory slide? There we go. Internet aggression, online problems, and online solutions, precisely because of the point David was making, which is that we are often, especially in mental health and mental health research, very siloed. We either study negative aspects of social media and internet-related technologies, or we study solutions. You either study cyberbullying or you study mobile psychotherapy apps. And very few people actually try to look at the angle from a research perspective, at the problem from a research perspective from both angles. And that's absolutely crucial. And that's what drew me to this gathering today. So not that long ago, websites were seen as simply, hosting or distributing places. So whatever users posted online was not the responsibility of the website owner. Websites were protected by the Communications Decency Act from 1996, which basically immunized them against what users of these websites posted on blogs, social networks, etc. So if somebody was the victim of defamation, misinformation, privacy invasion, sexual predation, cyberbullying, you name it, websites enjoyed a great amount of protection. And in general, there was this very sort of laissez-faire attitude toward the internet. Less intervention is better, because more intervention is gonna, squash this, revolution that's taking place and all the wonderful opportunities that it was bringing with it. Well, it took a while, but things have changed, and they have changed in a good way. As users now, we have more nuanced views of what technology brings, both the good and the bad. We went from assuming that technology and internet revolution was bringing this perfect democracy, right? Athens without slaves, to really questioning the potential negative effects on democracy itself of some of what the internet has brought. Similarly, regulatory bodies are much more active in trying to tame some of the downsides that have come with this technology. An example I like to talk about is European Union's right to be forgotten. So an element of your biography that's 30 years old, that's completely irrelevant, but somehow still preventing you from finding a job, does it really have to be there? Or do you, as a human being, enjoy a fundamental right to privacy? Well, the European Union thinks so. Businesses are starting to express a desire to do the right thing, to be good citizens. And the recent announcement by Facebook about modifying the newsfeed algorithm is very much a step in that direction. So this is a healthier place to be in terms of how we consume technology and how we relate to technology. This awakening at the personal level, at the business level, at the regulatory government level is a good thing. And it's a good thing because we have 2 decades worth of research now, research into similarities between overuse of internet-related technologies and other types of addiction, research into soaring rates of attention deficit, research into some of the aggressive impulses that happen online. And this research body really dictates that we consume these technologies with more responsibility and self-awareness. Unfortunately, virtual interactions can nurture some negative personality traits, and this is why I subtitled my book the dangerous powers of the E-personality. Some negative aspects of our personalities come out across virtual platforms, including narcissism, impulsivity, regression, aggression, etc. And these personality traits don't stay online. Instead, they seep into offline life, transforming us and transforming our culture at large into something more similar to avatars. Society ends up looking basically like an unregulated messaging blog. And that's not necessarily a good thing. So why do these personality traits come out on virtual platforms? Well, there's of course anonymity. If you're hidden behind this veil of anonymity, then you're more likely to allow yourself to express yourself in ways that are less than noble, less than civilized, less than polite. But that's not the entire answer. A lot of our interactions, our emails, our texts, they carry our signature, our name, or our phone number, and yet they're not as proper as maybe they should be. Another reason for this is invisibility. Even if the person knows who you are, the fact that they can't see you face to face, again, allows for these traits to come out more easily. If you think back to the old psychiatric school of psychoanalysis, the analyst would always sit behind the patient. And why is that? There's no eye contact. And if there isn't eye contact, the patient is much more comfortable opening up about taboos and instincts and dark desires, etc. Lack of hierarchy. I talked about how the internet was seen as a perfect democracy, and that's in a sense true, for better or worse. We're all equal and equal to the speed of our modem, and without built-in hierarchies between parent and child, between teacher and student, again, we allow ourselves to express ourselves in ways that are less regulated and more disinhibited. So several factors contribute to this kind of e-personality surfacing, and it recalls what Sigmund Freud wrote about over a century ago in his kind of theory of personality, the id, that dark, inaccessible part of our personality, a chaos, a cauldron of seething excitation, undisciplined, etc. So we may have killed off Freud too soon in psychiatry, because a lot of his theories have found kind of a expression in this new medium. Now, his solution was for the child to incorporate a superego, this voice of authority that helps the child self-regulate, that helps him or her develop morality and a sense of right and wrong. Well, if you look at many of our unregulated online platforms, there's really no deference, no concern for authority, rules, or manners very often. And again, recalls what Freud had to say about the id. And for Freud, this would be a threat to civilization itself. The problem before us is how to get rid of the greatest hindrance to civilization, namely the constitutional inclination of human beings to be aggressive toward one another. These are built-in instincts, according to Freud. Much of civilization is about kind of controlling them and allowing them to have outlets that are healthier. And somehow a lot of the platforms that we see online represent kind of a shortcut to this id, allowing it to resurface in all its glory. Of course, I cannot come up with a comprehensive list of online aggressive expression, but there are there are expressions at the level of the state, at the level of society, and of course at the level of the individual. NATO, as of last couple of years ago, made cyber warfare a new formal arena for war operations, besides the old land, air, and sea. Socially, I think all you have to do is look at political discourse in this country, both offline and the offline, online and the offline consequences of that, to see how easy it is for people to radicalize, become polarized, splinter online, and that's ironic given kind of the global village that the internet was supposed to be. Also, all sorts of access to ways for misbehaving. As an educator, I deal with this all the time. People cutting and pasting their homework or papers that they have to write. Now, this is not there's nothing new about that, but the fact that it's become so much easier and access has become so much more automatic has real life consequences. Of course, cyberbullying, flaming, trolling on the more personal level, all these are expressions of this aggression that comes out so automatically and so naturally online. And finally, of course, suicide, which, to go back to the psychoanalytic tradition, was referred to as aggression against the self, aggression turned inward. And our threshold for hurting others changes online. It becomes lower, and so maybe our threshold to hurt ourselves. And I'll talk more about this. So why should this matter? Why should we care? Well, virtual violence, does not stay there, and it might be more worrisome than other forms of media violence. When novels first came around, people thought they would spell the end of civilization. Similar with the radio, movies, etc. But the internet may be different in that it's much more interactive. It talks back to you, it rewards you, it punishes you. You're not a passive recipient of the online experience. You're very much an active participant, and for this reason, if you think, for example, at VR video games, for this reason, it's easier to confuse with real life, and easier to import some of these issues into real life. There's some intriguing research, certainly needs to be replicated and has been challenged in other studies, but enough of a red flag to be worth mentioning, which is what happens when kids are exposed to habitual violence through violent video games. One study that I find interesting looked at over 15,000 subjects taken from the US and Japan, so two very different cultures with very different kind of thresholds and relationships to violence, and assessed them twice during the school year. And what they saw was that habitual players of violent virtual games were twice as likely to be aggressive offline later in that year, and that those results held when corrected for gender and for baseline aggression, and they were similar in magnitude in those two very different cultures. Again, more research is needed, but enough of a red flag to for us to be concerned. Cyberbullying, of course, is another example of all too common online aggression. Has been given several other names as well, cyberstalking, etc. And the definition that I like to use and that I've used in my work is any behavior performed through electronics, it has to be electronic to be cyber, or digital media by individuals or groups that repeatedly, for it to be bullying, there has to be repetition. So repeatedly communicates hostile or aggressive messages intended to harm someone or produce discomfort. So there has to be intent as well. And it's an example of kind of bullying on steroids in a sense. So an example of an old form of aggression, of violence that has been transformed in kind of a worse way via these technologies. So how does it compare with traditional bullying? The cyberbully is unknown often. So if you're the victim, you're not sure who to protect yourself against. Cyberbullying can happen around the clock, so it's no longer limited to the bus or the schoolyard. kids are very reluctant, in my experience, to complain about cyberbullying because the last thing they want to see is for their electronics to be taken away or their time online to be curtailed. This is fascinating to me. It's easier for the victim of cyberbullying to become a bully himself or herself. There isn't as much need for physical power or strength or any of that. I've discussed this in other groups, and some kids see it as empowering, and I think I can see why they see it that way, but at the same time, it's a sad commentary on our culture that the only way we can protect ourselves from a situation like this is to bully back. And there's the fact that the evidence or the attack stays online forever waiting to be Googled. And there's a record of these attacks that stays with the individual way beyond their school age year. And in extreme examples, of course, they can go viral. So the statistics are pretty scary. 20 to 40% of children and adolescents, females and sexual minorities are at higher risk. Perpetrators are more likely to be male, although not by a huge percentage. Talked about the bully victim phenomenon, and of course the link to suicide. And I'll use this as a jumping board to discussing suicide in more detail. There's some very scary statistics that came out just last year covering the period from 1999 to 2014. And according to the CDC, so the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the rates of suicide climbed 24%. And this was accurate across all age groups, but also in both males and females. The largest increase happened in girls aged 10 to 14. So many, so pretty a stark and scary statistic for which many reasons have been offered, including warnings on the use of antidepressants that have led doctors to prescribe antidepressants less frequently to many adolescents and children who may have depression and may be at risk for suicide. Other psychosocial stressors, if you look at this period, this coincides, at least the second half of it coincides with a Great Recession and a lot of psychosocial turmoil as a result of that, etc. So many reasons have been put forward, but there also might be a link to the internet and how big a role the internet is playing in reconfiguring the suicide landscape. There's really been a complete redrawing, I think, of this landscape. So much so that what we learn about suicide now is different from when I trained as a psychiatrist not that long ago. So if you go online, this has been researched. If you look at my review, you can find more details on this. But there are pro-suicide websites that can either provide foolproof recipes for old, well-known methods on how to end your life, or teach new obscure methods that in the old days required months and years of research and dusty books and libraries. All you have to do is go online and But there's also the phenomenon of suicide pacts, where individuals who don't know one another, often living in different communities, different countries, choose to end their lives together. There's the performative aspect of live suicides that we're reading about. There's cyberbullying that we talked about and its connection. Also, more isolation. Are we becoming more isolated because of our time with electronics? As a result, perhaps more depressed and less supported, and maybe more at risk for suicide. When I trained, they would always teach us to ask patients if they have access to weapons. That was like the must-ask question for anyone at risk for suicide. And we certainly still ask that, but before I asked that, I ask my patients if they've been Googling suicide lately, because this has been kind of like the gateway for many suicides, unfortunately. However, however, these technologies are here to stay. No one wants to go to live life before Google, or wants to turn the clock, or thinks they can turn the clock. So these technologies are here to stay. We are all addicted, and logging off is not an option. So it's imperative to find ways to use them in healthy and responsible ways. We must leverage technology to solve technology-related problems. So if you focus on suicide specifically, Facebook in 2011 partnered with the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. So now suicidal comments voiced or expressed on Facebook can be reported, and Facebook reaches out to the person and connects them with the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Twitter has a similar approach, a team devoted to handling threats of self-harm or suicide. Instagram, Snapchat, and you'll be hearing more about what After School does as well. So these interventions have been studied to some degree, not as much as they should be, but to some degree, and they have been found to be feasible, meaning doable from a technical standpoint, certainly, but also as part of normal online discourse. They have been shown to be safe. What still requires more work and more research is really determine how efficacious they are. And again, for something that has transformed our lives so radically and in every possible way, the internet and internet-related technologies have not received the kind of mental health research that they deserve to receive. And this is one area where research is still lacking. And I take this opportunity to call for more research and insist on more research, and ask you to insist through your voices on that. And when we talk about using technologies that are here to stay, that we are all hooked on in positive ways, I have to talk about telepsychiatry, a big and growing field. Silicon Valley being one of the poles that are very active on this front now. So using technology as a tool to improve mental health and treat mental illness. So there are software-based interventions now that if you have obsessive compulsive disorder with a particular fear, let's say a contamination obsession, there's an online program that you can go through that does not involve a therapist, that can help expose you and desensitize you to some of these fears. There's video-based therapy that you can use, so that if you live in rural California and don't have access to an eating disorders specialist, let's say, you can now connect with one using some of these new technologies. There are mobile apps, including mobile anti-suicide apps that you're going to be hearing about during this conference. Cognitive training, people with early dementia, what we call mild cognitive impairment. Interesting research on how technology can be used to improve their memory and protect them against potentially against Alzheimer's and illnesses of that nature. Artificial intelligence is hot now and receiving more attention, as is virtual reality therapy. And I'll just show you a couple of slides specifically on virtual reality therapy, because it's a great example of taking something that can be very problematic as a violent VR game, and using it, turning it around and using it as a mental health tool. So exposure, that using virtual reality to 3D environments that are convincing, that are immersive, and that can desensitize the person to their fear, whether it's fear of flying, fear of bridges, fear of tunnels, you name it. Cost is no longer a big impediment, as these technologies have become cheaper, and technical know-how is no longer a big impediment either. Most of the data in virtual reality therapy is from the field of anxiety, whether it's OCD or other types of specific anxieties. But there's interesting data from other areas, including addiction. So if somebody is at a high risk for relapsing after they see particular cues, then they can be desensitized to that through virtual reality with the help of a therapist. Or the body distortion that can happen. Eating disorder, again, has been targeted by eating disorders. So this is what a virtual reality session might look like in a therapist's office. This is the software from Limbic specifically that desensitizes people to phobia against driving on bridges. This is the Golden Gate Bridge, as you recognize, or fear of flying. So very realistic depictions of common scenarios that can be targeted through telepsychiatry and virtual reality therapy. So this brings me to the end of my talk. We covered a lot in a very short period of time. I thank you for your attention. I'll be around afterwards for questions. So I don't want to cut into anybody else's time. Thank you very much.